Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if the Bronze Age collapse never happened. The Bronze Age collapse happened, as the name already indicates, during the end of the Bronze Age. It was an almost apocalyptic event in history, and there were many different sub-events happening during this time period. There was a climatic change due to volcano eruptions, you had huge displacements of peoples, there was an invasion of a group called the Sea Peoples. There was also warfare with iron-based weapons, and also a variety of political and societal collapse that was happening everywhere, as well as economical failures. But also with all of that, many major cities were destroyed within 40 to 50 years, according to some specialists. Trade was disrupted and thus literacy went down. To sum it up, it was a vicious circle. Several elements can't be changed, but I will propose one point of divergence, that being the volcano eruptions. Let's say this never happened. So you would not really have sea peoples, they would then probably not exist at all, and iron-based weapons, well, they would spread, but mostly through trade, for instance. And we would not see such a huge migration wave in that period of 1200 BC until 1150 BC. So let's ask ourselves, what if the Bronze Age collapse never happened? Well, first of all, this won't mean that we will have an eternal Bronze Age. I mean, the Bronze Age will end gradually, but not abruptly, and without a Dark Age, of course. Second of all, this will have huge implications, at least politically speaking. Although Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse, they were already in a very bad shape. And the countless fights and battles with the Hittite Empire left them very weakened. Without the Sea Peoples and Celtic peoples, as well as other Indo-Europeans fighting the Hittite Empire, they would be in a really good shape to dominate the whole area and to establish some kind of sphere of influence. The Minoans were already weakened, and thus Mycenae would, as in OTL, annex them, and the Greece, as we know today, would be a very different one. It would be one where Mycenae, instead of other Greeks such as Sparta or Athens, would be known for. Culturally, this would have far-reaching implications. Many legends would just never exist. No myth around the Battle of Troy, although yes, I know Troy existed. The Greek terms as we have them nowadays, languages, political systems, all of this would be butterflied away. And with the spread of metallurgy, the Phrygians and Dorians could still advance into Mycenae. However, as it was the case with Babylonia, for instance, they would be absorbed by this Mycenaean culture. Mycenae would become an absolute monarchy. Troy could serve as important trade hub and trade city, and perhaps even conserve its independence for some time. But then we will also have some colonies of Troy, which would then maybe be established in Crimea and even some parts of the Mediterranean. Mesopotamia would still be very, very much chaotic, and I honestly don't know whether Nebuchadnezzar would arise or not. Elam, or this part that is in southwestern Persia, they would still exist, and Persia would maybe never really get an Indo-Aryan population, but this whole geographical area would still be a very good place for an empire to arise. Third of all, such a scenario would open up a few interesting possibilities for the Phoenicians, the Sicani, the Nurage, and the Taurians. The Nurage, they were an ancient population of Sardinia. The Taurians, they were very similar, but they lived in Corsica, and the Sicani lived in Sicily. In this ATL, the Phoenicians would still sail around the Mediterranean, but because most trade routes they would still be intact, they would not really be able to take advantage of the disappearance of many trade routes, and there would also not be any power vacuum left, because the Hittites were there and strong as ever, and thus these Phoenicians in this timeline, they would never really be able to do something. And they might still go to Carthage or northern Tunisia and settle there, but they would never really become this maritime power as Carthage was known in our timeline. Instead, the Sicani of Sicily would have a chance to form some sort of kingdom, and the Taurians as well from Corsica with the Nurage, they could become a small maritime power at first. Both have similar cultures, Taurians and the Nurage. They are very close to each other, but they needed goods from the mainland, and they were a little bit far away from the mainland. As a result, Corsica, Sardinia would have colonies in southern France, western Italy, and eastern Spain. Corsica, Sardinia would come into contact with the Phoenicians, get maybe a writing system or change the writing system that the Phoenicians had, and without the Bronze Age collapse, literacy would increase in many areas where trade would still be done. Fast forward, and without any serious competition, Corsica, Sardinia would have really good chances to take bigger parts of Spain, France, Italy, and they would integrate the Sicani in their newly formed empire. Fight this ATL version of Carthage, get colonies in Libya, while Troy would have the same fate as the Phoenicians, and they would probably become part of the sphere of influence of the Hittite Empire. Mykenæ would not compete. Mykenæ would compete mostly with the Proto-Illyrians and Proto-Dacians, while Elam would have possibilities to become the ATL's Persia. The Hittites, they would have very good cards to become the strongest power in the Middle East, and even take Mesopotamia, and perhaps even reaching the interior of Egypt. While Corsica, Sardinia, they would establish more presence along the Nile Delta for trade purposes. At some point, Elam would face an invasion from the steppe, while Troy's colonies could influence the region around southern Ukraine, and we could see city-states evolve in that area. The Balkans and southern Ukraine would become integral part of this old world. At some point, the Hittites could be able to pull off something as the Achaemenid Empire, and they would thus become really, really strong. Together with the Proto-Illyrians, the Proto-Dacians, Mykenæ would be taken out, while Corsica, Sardinia would be similar in size as, let's say, Western Rome, as they were continuously in search for resources to trade for. Britain would be reached, Cornwall would be made an integral part of their trading network, and a trading post in sub-Saharan Africa would not be impossible. The question in that moment would be who would stay in power. The Hittites could lose most of the territories because they ruled over people who had already a very strong sense of identity. And Elam, Persia, would always pose a danger, but never become really so dangerous that they would suddenly also take out Corsica, Sardinia. Because remember, Persia's problem is mostly that they could have invasions from the steppe or from places like Afghanistan. The Mycenaeans, they could also always rebel within the Hittite Empire, the Egyptians too, and the coast of the Hittites, well, was very weakly defended. And the Hittites never had this idea to defend their coasts. Whereas Corsica, Sardinia, they could actually do something about it. If we check the buildings and the old archaeological sites of Corsica and Sardinia, we see that they had towers and they also established some type of defenses. And if they would come into contact also with the Western Atlantic trade culture, as it is called, they would probably also have better towers where they could watch over a bigger area, and they would also suddenly start to build maybe tiny walls and also make some trenches as well. The only other risk that Corsica, Sardinia could have is that they would be overstretched. But strategically they would have the upper hand if we compare them to the Hittite Empire. Also with Crimea and southern Ukraine evolving city-states, there would always be this sense of unpredictability, which could be a huge damage to the Hittites. A strong Corsican Sardinian captain, few allies here and there, and perhaps a crisis with Persia, Elam, could bring a really huge doom to the Hittites. Many Greek islands would then be controlled by Corsica, Sardinia, all of Egypt too, Cyprus, areas around Phoenicia would become semi-independent, and Elam would take Mesopotamia, but probably implode at another period of the time. The Illyrians, the Dacians, the Troy-Crimeans, and the southern Ukrainians would by now have very developed civilizations, while Corsica, Sardinia, with the influence of Egypt and their abundance of resources, could develop a unique architecture and many infrastructures. Trade with Yemen, India, Indonesia, and even China would be very, very possible. The non-collapse would spread technologies faster, literacy would be spread faster as well, and the economy of this ATL would be one of supply and demand and free circulations. Corsica, Sardinia would have an elite of rich traders, experienced captains, and instead of Rome, Sardinia would become a world metropolis, or maybe Corsica, getting supplies from an alternate Barcelona, let's say, in the west, alternate Carthage in the south, an alternate Marseille in the north, and an alternate Naples or Napoli from the east. With the trade routes intact and a booming economy, technology would at first be very much pragmatic, but become more refined, and without the collapse, this ATL could even be more advanced than our OTL. Africa, Western Europe, the Balkans, and the Black Sea region, they would become connected with the Mediterranean, and the world would be unrecognizable, with Europe having a Nuragian, Taurian, and a Hittite, Egyptian culture. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.